Hello everyone, one of the biggest threats to the Hexen Circle, the Witch Hunter Prune, will be the one new 4-star character releasing in patch Luna 7. While she may seem just like a random 4-star, Prune is looking to be especially valuable to mainly Varka teams, giving them a much needed damage buff alongside the other new Hexari related additions, while also having a few use cases outside of Varka teams as well. So to see how useful Prune can be, in this guide I will be covering how her kit works, the best ways to build her potential best teams, and analyzing her place in the meta in terms of overall strength and pull value, and citing of course various pre-release calcs on Prune from multiple different theory crafters. Prune is a 4-star Animo Catalyst support who ascends with attack. She will be considered a Hexari character once you complete her Witch's homework quest, so she will gain important bonuses when there are a total of at least 2 Hexari characters on the team. Using Prune's elemental skill makes her attack with her Bane Hunter Oathhammer, dealing Animo damage and generating 5 Animo particles. If this triggers a swirl reaction, the Bane Hunter Oathhammer becomes infused with the element that was just swirled and allows you to press her skill again to do another attack, this time dealing elemental damage of the infused element. Prune's elemental burst deals 1 instance of Animo damage on cast, then summons a bell that follows the active character for 12 seconds at C0. This bell will deal AoE Animo damage to nearby enemies every 2 seconds. With Prune's A1 passive, if this attack from the bell triggers swirl, an infused Bane Hunter Oathhammer will be summoned, dealing elemental damage based on the element that was swirled. These A1 attacks won't apply any element on the enemy however. The infused Bane Hunter Oathhammers from both Prune's skill and her burst enable her main buff to the team, which comes from her A4 passive. When an enemy is hit by an elemental infused Bane Hunter Oathhammer, all other party members excluding Prune will gain an effect called Tolling Rally for 5 seconds. This buffs the damage of their normal attacks, charge attacks, plunging attacks, elemental skills, and elemental bursts, scaling with Prune's attack past 2000. To get the max 50% damage buff, Prune needs to have at least 4000 attack in combat. Attack percent buffs from the team like Shavers' A4, Fischl's Hexari passive, or artifact set buffs like Tenacity of the Belitith can help Prune reach 4000 attack in combat easier to maximize her buff. However, attack buffs like from Bennett, Eonsan, and even Nicole will not help with scaling Prune's A4 buff. Realistically, Prune needs C6 to achieve the max buff, but regardless, 4000 attack is not a necessity, getting as much as you can is fine. Prune's Hexari passive assists her attack needs to increase her buff. With at least 2 Hexari characters on the team, if specifically a Hexari character that has the Tolling Rally effect, aka they are buffed by Prune's A4 passive, triggers an elemental reaction, Prune will get 60% attack for 5 seconds. Now if a Hexari character specifically triggered a swirl reaction, that character will get 30% attack for 5 seconds. So Prune grants an additional attack buff for Hexari characters that trigger swirl, which is mainly just Varka and Venti, making them the only 2 practical characters currently that can take full advantage of Prune's kit. Lastly, her exploration passive is just the standard talent crafting material one. That's everything on Prune's base kit. Gameplay wise, she's very simple. You can just skill and trigger swirl, skill again to hit with an infused hammer, then burst, which is fine if she's going right before the main DPS since the second skill will immediately activate her A4 buff. However, optimal rotations currently don't have her going before the main DPS. For instance, in a Varka team, the current optimal rotation order goes Durin, then Prune, then Nicole, then Varka, and in these cases, you can just skill once on Prune for the particles, then burst and swap out, relying on the infused Bane Hunter Oathhammers from her burst to apply her A4 buff and lower her field time requirements. Activation of the buff via Prune's burst does have some initial delay, but since you're swapping to Nicole first before the main DPS, you're covered. In terms of talent leveling priority, her burst is slightly more important than her skill, but honestly, leveling her talents is not very important at all since they only serve to increase her personal damage, which is very minor. So you could just level them to 6 to save resources, or just not level them at all. In my opinion, leveling her to 90 for more attack is more important to maximize her buff to the team. Next, let's run through Prune's Constellations because as a 4-star, she of course has some important ones. C1 gives Prune 2 flat energy whenever an infused Bane Hunter Oathhammer hits an enemy, considerably reducing her energy requirements. C2 gives Prune 10% attack when she uses her burst, and then additional attack when infused hammers summoned from her burst via her A1 passive hits enemies, stacking up to a total of 40% attack. C3 grants 3 burst talent levels. C4 enables an additional instance of damage to the infused Bane Hunter Oathhammer attacks. This extra damage does work in single target and helps stack her C2 faster, but doesn't apply any element. C5 grants 3 skill talent levels, and finally C6 extends Prune's burst duration by 4 seconds. And when characters that are affected by the Tolling Rally effect, meaning they are buffed by Prune's A4 passive, trigger an elemental reaction, both Prune and the active character will gain 350 attack for 5 seconds. Overall, Prune is your average modern Genshin 4-star in terms of constellations. C2 is the main early breakpoint that gives a decent damage increase as the extra attack increases her A4 damage buff. C3, C4 C4 and C5 collectively is just a minor team damage increase, and then C6 gives Prune a significant increase in supportive power by giving her more attack and giving the active character an additional attack buff. Without C6, Prune will provide much less team damage. Now, let's cover Prune's best build options. Since Prune's main team buff scales with attack, she primarily wants to use weapons that give attack, with energy recharge being a secondary priority since she's burst reliant. So 5-star weapons like Skyward Atlas, Memory of Dust, and Shen Yun's signature will be good to use since they give a lot of attack. For 4-star weapons, the event weapon, Oathsworn Eye, is a solid choice since it has a high base attack for a 4-star weapon, attack percent as the substat, and gives energy recharge after Prune uses her skill. The Fontaine Craftable is a good alternative if you don't have Oathsworn Eye, as it gives the same amount of attack, but just doesn't give ER in its passive and instead has a useless passive. Lastly, Favonius Codex is one of Prune's best weapon options because although it doesn't give her that much attack, it gives her energy recharge and extra energy for the team, which can be extremely valuable, especially when Prune is played with Nicole. Favonius Codex Prune allows Nicole to use one of the more attack-oriented catalysts that doesn't give ER in a team where she wants to use her burst, such as a Varka team, without having to use an ER sans. Thus, I would rank Prune's weapon options like this. Favonius Codex is one of the best choices, as good as a 5-star weapon if she or the team needs energy, such as in a Varka team with Nicole. Then the 5-star oriented catalysts are good options. If you don't have those 5-star weapons, then you can use a 4-star attack oriented catalyst. And then lastly, Favonius Codex if you don't need the extra energy. For artifacts, Prune is an anima support, so in pretty much all of her teams, she uses 4-piece Viridescent Venerer for the red shred after swirling an element, pretty self-explanatory. The one other niche set she can specifically use for DPS Venti is 4-piece Scroll, where she can give 12% animo damage bonus to him after triggering swirl. For main stats, you ideally just want full attack to get as much attack as possible to maximize Prune's A4 buff. Energy Recharge Hourglass can be used if necessary. For substats, focus on attack and ER, and also aim for crit rate if you're using Favonius Codex. While specifically 4000 attack, including in-combat attack percent buffs, is needed for Prune to max her A4 passive buff, she generally won't reach 4000 attack without C6 and a high attack weapon. But regardless of whether you have C6 or not, getting as much as you can is perfectly fine. You don't need 4000 attack. In terms of her energy requirements, it depends on whether you have certain constellations or if you're using Favonius Codex. I have some recommended ER goals shown here, but remember, more is always appreciated. Finally, let's go over Prune's best team comps. Prune is strongest as a support when in a team that fully takes advantage of her Hexorite passive, where she gives an additional attack buff to specifically Hexorite characters that trigger swirl. The one character that greatly takes advantage of this is Varka. As a result, Prune mainly serves as a new specialized support for him, providing Varka teams a much needed upscale in terms of damage. With the introduction of Nicole and the new Hexorite support set as well, Varka's pyro teams have gotten a significant upgrade and is by far Varka's strongest team archetype, where Prune replaces Venti, who was previously the best anima support for Varka. With just C0 Prune, she will be better than any anima support other than C0 Venti, but C0 Prune isn't necessarily better than C0 Venti in terms of damage. Some calcs have her slightly above him, but some have her slightly below him. With C2, she is overall slightly better than Venti damage-wise, and with C6, she provides significantly more team damage to Varka. Having both Nicole and Durin is ideal, but if you have only one of them, you can use Bennett to substitute the other, and the team will still be fine. To give some additional updated info on specifically Varka himself and his pyro teams, for combos, he still has his baseline easy normal attack spam combo, but for more optimized combos, he has one focusing on N4s and N1s, and a new longer combo that takes advantage of N1Cs, recommended mainly with Nicole due to her longer buff duration and shield to more easily do the charge attacks. For builds, not much has changed. At C0, Varka still prefers Pyro Goblet, mainly because his best combos with N1Cs deal more pyro damage. Attack Goblet is still close in performance though, especially if you don't do the N1C combos and just do normal attack spam, since that combo does a little less pyro damage, but ultimately you can choose whichever one you have better stats on. With C1 Nicole, which adds more projections that deal animo damage, Animo Goblet becomes more similar to Pyro Goblet in performance. And for those of you that have C2 Varka, Attack Goblet will just be better. In terms of vertical investment for the team, Jaxon made a nice table comparing the team damage of Varka, Prune, Durin, and Nicole with varying levels of investment. The key takeaways here are that Varka vertical is the best, Nicole's and Durin's signatures are both similar damage increases, and both are very slightly better than getting either Durin's or Nicole's C1s, and Durin and Nicole's C2s are also similar damage increases. One last thing to add is that going from C2 to C6 Prune is a similar damage increase to getting either Nicole's or Durin's signature for a Varka team. So going for Durin or Nicole constellations while also getting Prune constellations, or pulling on the weapon banner for Durin and Nicole's signature weapons are both valid options for Varka. Now while Varka's pyro teams are currently his main team since they deal the most damage, Prune does improve his other elemental teams as well. Hydro Varka can have Mona hold TTDS and the new Hextrai support set to give 40% Hydro and Anemo damage bonus to Varka while he's on field. For Electro Varka, while Fischl's own Hextrai buff doesn't do anything in this team, she can hold the new set for 40% Electro damage and Anemo damage bonus for Varka. However, because the set only activates on skill cast, Fischl needs to use specifically Sacrificial Bow in order for her to use her skill every rotation and trigger the 4-piece bonus, unless you decide to swap into her just to recast Oz, which is not ideal. Lastly, while C2 plus Prune being a higher damaging Anemo support than Venti does improve his cryo teams, they don't look to get as much of an upgrade compared to the other elemental teams because there is currently no good Hextrai cryo support available that can hold the new Hextrai support set. The only cryo Hextrai character currently is Lohan, but he's an on-field DPS so he won't provide much value to a team as a Varka support. While Prune is primarily a support for Varka, she can work with other carries as well. Venti is the other main Hextrai character who triggers Swirl, so he can take full advantage of Prune's Hextrai passive just like Varka when playing him as a main DPS. Since Venti main DPS deals majority Anemo damage however, C6 Farazan is still better than C6 Prune. Even C1 Albedo looks to provide more damage, but Prune is a fine alternative support for DPS Venti, especially if you don't have C6 Farazan, as any constellation of Prune will be on par or better than her in terms of damage. While mainly only Varka and Venti can get the extra attack buff from Prune, Prune can still work as a support for other teams as long as there is another Hextrai character present that can trigger a reaction so that Prune could get 60% attack from her Hextrai passive to give her a higher damage percent buff from her A4. To give a few examples, Prune can serve as the final support for Hydro drivers like Mona, Ayato, and Child, who enables Vaporize reactions for Dark Mode Durin, acting as an alternative to supports like Shilonen and Sucrose. She can also serve as a support for Lohan driver teams that enable Dark Mode Durin to melt if you don't have Sitlali. She can work in an aggravate team to buff both the Electro main DPS and Fischl's off-field damage, and she can function as the Anemo support for Flynn's if you're using Fischl instead of Anefa. In these teams, Prune is fine as a support, however, in some of the teams where Prune works, other supports are generally stronger options than her, or in some cases, Prune really depends on her C6 to actually shine. So while Prune can still definitely work outside of Varka teams, from a strict meta perspective, she's still mainly a Varka support. To conclude this Prune guide, here is my analysis on her place in the meta in terms of overall strength and pull value. Compared to other specific specialized 4-star supports, Prune can function outside of her intended dedicated team, since she provides damage percent to normal attacks, charge attacks, plunging attacks, elemental skills, and elemental bursts with her A4 passive, and gives additional attack with her C6. Prune can play as a more generic Anemo support. She's not completely generic however, as she ideally wants to pair with a Hextrai teammate that can trigger reactions so that Prune has more attack to give a larger damage percent buff, which does limit the teams where Prune can actually work well. But when Prune does fit well in the team, she can act like a better version of Coswell for team buffing without the grouping and CC. While Prune can play as a support for different DPSs, ultimately her main purpose and meta value are for Hextrai DPSs that can trigger Swirl, where she grants them an additional attack buff. And while DPS Venti is one of the characters who can take advantage of this, the one main character that really benefits from Prune's kit is Varka. With Prune's introduction as Varka's new semi-dedicated 4-star support, all of Varka's elemental teams are getting a damage upgrade. If you didn't have Varka's previous best Anemo support Venti, C0 Prune alone will be better than Varka's other Anemo support options. But when comparing Prune to Venti specifically, Venti does uniquely have grouping with his burst and a flat 15 energy refund to whichever element his burst infuses with, which can be very helpful in the right scenarios. But in terms of raw damage, a C2 Prune will already be better than C0 Venti, and a C6 Prune will provide significantly more damage to a Varka team. Prune to Varka is effectively how Itlua is to Zibai. The increased damage of his Hydro, Electro, and Cryo teams does help with Varka's flexible team building, which is great for less difficult combat content, but with the simultaneous release of Nicole, Varka's Pyro teams are by far his strongest team archetype in terms of damage, and thus will be his most meta-relevant team. With C6 Prune, Nicole, and the new Hextrai support set, C0 Varka's best Pyro team is now calcing at around a similar team DPS number as the current premium C0 Flynn's team at KQM standard. Considering the damage performance of Varka on his release, it's great to see Varka getting a significant damage buff from everything being released in Luna 7, and is now able to be more on par with the lunar teams in terms of damage. But while this currently increases Varka's value, and by extension Prune's value from a meta perspective, there are a few caveats to Varka's newfound strength. The main thing to remember is that Varka's highest theoretical damage numbers all require C6 Prune, and as I'm sure everyone knows by now, getting C6 of a newly released 4-star can be very difficult to do without spending a lot of pools, so a lot of people may not have access to C6 Prune for the big Varka damage upgrade. Varka is pretty much in the same position as Zibai was on her release, as part of both of their power budgets are locked behind C6 4-star supports. The other point I want to highlight is because Hextri Shield endgame content hasn't been that restrictive, and Varka is effectively a pyro DPS in the current hardest endgame content, since its pyro teams deal the most damage, this means that Varka is directly competing with Mawika, which is a tall task. Now assuming you have all the pieces of Varka's best team like C6 Prune, Varka can technically perform as well or better than Mawika, mainly due to ease of use. While both of them have their own baseline and optimized combos, Mawika's optimized combos are, in my opinion, more advanced and difficult to learn with their CDC tech compared to Varka's, and there's less of a damage difference between the most optimized Varka combos and his normal attack spam versus Mawika's optimized combos and just doing her donuts, making Varka more casual friendly. So Varka will be a powerful pyro DPS option, especially if you don't have Mawika or are unable to play her well. However, if you already have an invested Mawika and you are able to do her more optimized combos which greatly increase her damage ceiling, then there's not really a good reason to invest in Prune and Varka in the current endgame meta unless you want a second pyro DPS with a lower damage ceiling. Varka does of course have his Hydro, Electro, and Cryo teams, but there is a significant damage gap between these teams and his pyro teams. While the Hydro, Electro, and Cryo teams are still fine in less difficult content at the moment, they are open to improvement with the release of newer supports. This may or may not happen with the new characters coming with Shnesnaya, but if it does, Varka, and by extension Prune, are going to gain more value. So in conclusion, if you have Varka, Prune is going to be an incredibly important 4-star support to get. But if you don't have Varka, Prune can still be an effective support for some select teams, but outside of Varka teams, she won't be as powerful as a support. That's everything I wanted to cover about Prune. A big thank you to theorycrafters hyperwebster, Jaxon, and Frost for allowing me to cite their calcs in this video. Always appreciative of their hard work and their help. I hope this guide and analysis was helpful to you all in giving you a better understanding of everything related to Prune. Just clicking and watching the video helps the channel out immensely, and if you want to show even more support, consider liking or sharing the video, or click the subscribe button for more Genshin guide and analysis videos in the future. Leave any questions in the comments, and for all of you planning on wishing, I wish you all the best of luck on your Prune pools.